What I'd like to do today is to really do three things. I want to talk a little bit about Samuel Howe and who he was, and then talk a little bit about why he interests me and why he continues to interest me. And third, talk a little bit about why Samuel Howe is important for disability studies. Howe was born on November the 22nd, 1801 in Boston to Joseph N. Howe, a maker of ropes for ships that sailed out of Boston Harbor, and Martha Gridley Howe. The middle child of three brothers and four sisters, Howe attended the elementary schools of Boston and the college preparatory school of the Reverend Joseph Henderson in Hingham. In 1821, he graduated from Brown University, where he had a reputation of being a better prankster than student. In 1824, he completed his medical education at the Harvard Medical College. Soon thereafter, he left for Greece, where for the next 6 years he participated in that nation's war of independence from the Turks. After the war's end, he secured provisions for Americans that he distributed to the war-torn Greek citizenry. Shortly after Howe's return to the United States in 1831, the trustees of Massachusetts' newly chartered School for the Blind, the first of its kind in the nation, appointed Howe as their director. Not long thereafter, Howe sailed to Europe to observe schools for the blind, returning in 1832 to open the blind school in Boston. During the earliest years of the new school, Howe used raised lettering to teach his pupils how to read. Besides reading, his students learned to write, and they learned about the material world through the use of embossed maps, globes, and stuffed animals, all of which the pupils could inspect through touch. First gaining regional fame by exhibiting his educated pupils throughout New England, Howe extended his own notoriety and that of the school to a worldwide audience after the blind and deaf girl Laura Bridgman entered the school in 1837. Under his direction, Laura learned to communicate through fingerspelling and writing. In 1842, the observations of Charles Dickens, recorded in his American Notes, only added to Bridgman's fame and to the fame of her educator. Before long, the Perkins Institution, the name that the blind school acquired after a bequest from the Boston merchant Thomas H. Perkins, became a place that thousands of Americans and Europeans knew about, and some were able to visit. In 1843, Howe, while a member of the Massachusetts legislature, championed Dorothea Dix's memorial to the legislature that called public attention to the inhumane conditions of mentally ill people in local almshouses and jails. In the same year, he married the New Yorker Julia Ward. On their honeymoon in Europe, Howe toured charitable institutions, schools, prisons, and met, among other people, Florence Nightingale, who credited him with first encouraging her to enter the nursing profession. Back in Boston in 1845, Howe found himself caught up in controversies over public school reform, where along with his friend Horace Mann, he championed an anti-Calvinist model of education, one that held that teachers' kindly guidance rather than their use of corporal punishment made for better learners. Not long thereafter, he also stirred controversy by advocating for the Philadelphia, or solitary confinement model of prison incarceration before the Boston Prison Discipline Society. In 1848, he received both public praise and ridicule after he convinced Massachusetts lawmakers to fund the first residential school for what were then called idiots. From the fall of 1841 to the spring of 1842, Howe traveled with his blind pupils west to Ohio and Kentucky, and as far south as Georgia and Louisiana. In these regions, Howe's lectures, along with demonstrations of his pupils' skills in reading, writing, mathematical computation, and music performance, led legislators to establish public facilities for educating the blind in their own states. Howe had written against slavery as early as 1833, but he became actively involved in Boston anti-slavery activities in 1846 when, along with other opponents of slavery like his friend Charles Sumner, he formed the Boston Vigilance Committee. Concerned with the abduction of fugitive slaves, the committee came together to protect former slaves from Southern slave catchers. Soon known as conscience Whigs, most members of the committee represented so-called political abolitionists, those who, unlike their contemporaries, the followers of William Lloyd Garrison, worked through political institutions to end slavery. With the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, his anti-slavery activities increased and intensified as his break from Daniel Webster and Massachusetts Cotton Whigs, Whigs who were sympathetic to Southern slavery, became final. Between 1851 and 1853, Howe became the editor of the Boston Commonwealth newspaper. Along with his wife, Julia, Howe used the newspaper to champion the cause of free soil anti-slavery. In 1854, he joined the New England Immigrant Aid Company that provided assistance to Northerners who had immigrated to Kansas to keep that territory free of slavery. Later that year, the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act solidified what became Howe's decade-long involvement with Kansas politics. Traveling to the state in 1857, Howe began his acquaintance with the abolitionist John Brown. In 1858 and 1859, this acquaintance developed into Howe's membership in the Secret Six, a group of anti-slavery campaigners who provided Brown funding and arms that Brown later used in his 1859 raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Howe spent the Civil War years as a member of both the United States Sanitary Commission and the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, and in 1854 became the chair of the Massachusetts State Board of Charities. During this time, Howe also advocated for the decentralization of services for the blind and for people with intellectual disability. To this end, he championed the boarding out of his school's pupils in the homes of ordinary citizens. Howe died in 1876. I first became interested in Howe while working on my book, Inventing the Feeble Mind. I soon learned that Howe was a figure of surprises and the unexpected. At the Hayes Research Library here at the Perkins School for the Blind, I first began to see just how fully interesting Howe's life was. Let me highlight a few categories. First, Howe was a member, albeit a somewhat peripheral member, of that group of men and women in antebellum eastern Massachusetts that we know as the American Renaissance. Among this group, Howe was a close friend of Horace Mann and Elizabeth Peabody. Besides these two figures, Howe employed Elizabeth Peabody's sister, Sophia, to sculpt a bust of Laura Bridgman, several plaster casts of which he took with him and gave away to influential lawmakers on his trip to the American West and South in 1841 and 42. By knowing Sophia Peabody through her sister Elizabeth, Hal became acquainted with the reclusive Nathaniel Hawthorne, whom Sophia married in July of 1842. Both Julia and Samuel Howe recall visiting the Hawthornes, then living in Concord, only to see glimpses of Nathaniel hurrying away to avoid their company. By knowing Elizabeth Peabody and Horace Mann, Howe also knew Elizabeth's other sister, Mary Peabody, who became Mann's bride shortly before the Manns joined the Howes for their honeymoons in May of 1843. Julia's sister also went with them. They were successful honeymoons. They produced 2 children out of that. Okay. Besides Mann and the Peabody sisters, the Perkins School historical material, in the Perkins School historical material alone, there is Howe correspondence with people who were members of the American Renaissance or were contemporaries of those members. And the list is just too long to go into. During the 3 years that I explored that material, as Jan suggested, there were literally daily surprises. I never knew when I would find another big name surprise. Here's just one example of a frequent occurrence. I came across an 1845 letter to Howe signed by S.M. Fuller. Something made me stop. It was not a particularly item-filled letter, but it ended with, "I hope to see Mrs. Howe when I come to the institution." The writer was obviously a friend of Julia Ward Howe, I thought. Could it be Margaret Fuller? But the signature was S.M. Fuller. After going to handy Wikipedia, academics do it, I found my answer. Margaret Fuller, the famed first feminist of the American Renaissance, was Sarah Margaret Fuller, hence S.M. Fuller. Second, besides his place in the American Renaissance, Howe had the most particular way of running into the most unexpected people. Take, for example, Davy Crockett, who visited the Perkins School in April of 1834, just 2 years before his death at the Battle of the Alamo. And then there's the better-known visit of Charles Dickens to the school in 1842, but less known are Howe's visit to Dickens on his 1843 honeymoon, and later Dickens' second visit to the Perkins Institution in 1868. During the Civil War at their home, Greenpeace, the Howes entertained the actor Edwin Booth and his new bride, Mary Devlin. Among the guests at that event was Edwin's brother, John Wilkes Booth. In their trip to Europe in 1850, the Howes became friends with a fellow passenger, the most important American actress of the time, Charlotte Cushman. And Fanny Kimball read to the pupils of the Perkins School, and those pupils heard the famed Jenny Lind sing at her Boston debut in 1850. In May 1859, on a journey to Cuba, the Howes became good friends with Wade and Sally Hampton. Such good friends that the Hamptons invited the Howes to spend 2 weeks at their plantation near Columbia, South Carolina. As Howe wrote Theodore Parker, Wade Hampton was rather taken with the novelty of a northern man talking rank abolitionism. Barely 5 months later, ironically enough, John Brown would carry out his raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, and Howe would soon become the bête noire of Southerners like the Hamptons. Then there were the unexpected, even strange relationships that Howe encountered, and sometimes created. As he searched for funds to print the first edition of the New Testament for blind readers, he managed to bring to agreement the impossible mix of Boston's strongest Calvinist, Lyman Beecher, and the city's most radical Unitarian, Theodore Parker, both agreeing, when they otherwise agreed on nothing, that printing a raised letter scripture for the blind was a good thing. Then there was the encounter Hal had in 1831 with the original Siamese twins, the conjoined brothers later known as the Bunkers. In New York, recently back from Greece, Hal happened upon an advertisement by the showman John W. Hale, promising to show the twins for the handsome price of 50 cents. At the time, the twins were hardly as famous as they would become once exhibited by P.T. Barnum. Hal challenged the authenticity of Hale's exhibit. Hale sued Hal for slander, and a year later, not long before he opened the School for the Blind, a New York jury found Hal innocent. The press reports about the slander, I don't know, but I imagine, piqued Barnum's curiosity, thus leading to the fame and fortune of the that the twins provided both Barnum and the twins themselves. Finally, why is Hal important for disability studies? I'd like to argue two concrete reasons and then a fairly amorphous reason. In August 1847, Hal wrote Horace Mann a letter that included a telling rhetorical question. Is not Calvinism the greatest obstacle to all kinds of human progress? The enemy of God, the libeler of his noblest son, our great elder brother. Hal, in a nutshell, articulated his contempt for the Calvinism of his ancestors. In the place of original sin and the need for atonement, he turned toward a 19th century Unitarianism that claimed, and now I'm using my words, salvation through education, a capacity given to human beings by God. Hal believed throughout his adult life, and as far as I can tell, he never wavered, that human beings, with our grandeur and our flaws, can change. And that with good education, change can be for the better. Always for Hal, education was both a means of self-improvement and a means of making the social fabric better. For the individual, education meant liberation and freedom from superstition, the great aim of the Enlightenment. But education also meant freedom's greatest competitor, equality. Education provided human beings with our otherwise endless diversities something in common. Education allowed for equality among diverse human beings. Male and female, white and black, Asian, European, African and American, labor and capital, disabled and able-bodied, all through education could blend their differences into a common good. The second concrete reason that Hal is important to disability studies follows from the first. Freedom and equality, that unlikely mixture articulated in the Declaration of Independence by Hal's favorite founding father, Thomas Jefferson, that unlikely mixture made possible in Hal's ever-hopeful view about education, had in the United States a terrible contradiction. Some people, even the majority of people, did not have access to education, and hence had no access to the changes made possible by education. At the same time, lacking access to education, large groups of people had no chance for self-improvement. And without that chance, humanity had no chance to effect its own social improvement. Salvation through education, God's greatest gift to human beings, becomes impossible in the absence of access. Whether the slave or the disabled person, or the woman, or the laborer, all hope for improvement, all hope for the good, becomes frustrated when one group of people blocks access to education for another group of people. Thus, freedom and equality are impossible without access, without the leading out into the world provided by education. It was in the face of his optimism about education and its frustration that led Howe to make what I believe to be his greatest contribution to disability studies, his confidence in the integration of traditionally devalued people into the life of ordinary communities. Education was necessary for personal and social betterment, but it was ultimately not sufficient. Anticipating John Dewey by several decades, Howe saw that education required struggle and power in the public sphere to reach its potential to affect freedom and equality, or as Dewey liked to say, democracy. And like Dewey, Howe was a true Democrat. Education without democratic struggle was always incomplete and often led to hideous consequences. And now for the amorphous reason. Howe was important for disability studies because Howe was a liberal. In the tradition of liberalism that we associate with John Dewey and Reinhold Niebuhr and Lionel Trilling, three scholars who, of course, would post-date Howe, Howe embodied faith in reason, in human give and take, in human inclusion, in power restrained by humility. Of the latter, I am taken aback by how many recent evaluations of Howe have assessed him as arrogant and rigid. Now, to be sure, he had strong opinions, strong presuppositions, but in my adventure into the head and world of Samuel Howe, I find a man given to self-criticism, one who apologizes to people he had offended, and one who changes position in the face of compelling evidence. Howe, if you will, was an experimenter, and like all good experimenters, he distrusted ideology. If he had one absolute, it was a liberal absolute. That is, that traditionally devalued people were always better off integrated into everyday social interactions, into everyday social arrangements. This integration became axiomatic, but it also had to be tested as it played out for groups of devalued people participating in day-to-day social interaction. Howe was wrong, I believe, in his insistence that deaf citizens reject manual signs for oralism. But his error was not the results of a lapse of liberalism. It was the results of the rigidity that accompanied his vision of integration. Like the perpetual need to negotiate freedom and equality, so too is there always the need to negotiate integration and identity. Howe's liberal spirit came out best in his reassessment of education, work, and living arrangements for his blind students and graduates of the schools he led. The reassessment began quite early. Indeed, in the mid-1840s, he began to question the institutional model that segregated people into a common school, living, and work spaces. As his tenure lengthened, his views about social integration became stronger. On his last trip to Europe in 1867, Howe visited the Belgian city of Kiel. So impressed by the community's housing of mentally ill residents in the homes of ordinary folk, Howe returned to Boston even more committed to community integration of people with disabilities. Howe was a liberal because he was able to practice what John Kenneth Galbraith called the emancipation of belief. He was a liberal because he could live with the tension of confidence and doubt. And I'd like to close by reading a fairly brief passage from the end of the first chapter of the book. This is the chapter that talks about how in the period before going to Greece, and this chapter refers to Hal's movement toward to participating in the Greek Revolution. He was set on his course, however, and could not be dissuaded. In November, just after Andrew Jackson won the presidential popular vote, only to lose a deciding vote in the House of Representatives a month later to John Quincy Adams. That sound like tomorrow? Hal left Boston on the Triton for a long journey, first to Malta and then to Greece. He left behind him the hint of an unrequited romance with Sophia Hyatt, a young woman whom he remembered fondly in his Greek diary and in a letter to his college friend, William Sampson. He carried with him a trunk of personal belongings, a letter of introduction from Edward Everett, a copy of the cantos of Byron's Childe Harold Pilgrimage, a limited knowledge of classical Greek, and a passing fluency in French, and a little money, which he had received from his father, from Everett, and from the painter Gilbert Stuart. Except for Jonathan Miller, he knew no one in Greece. On December 20th, 1824, just 5 days before he arrived to celebrate Christmas on Malta, Hal wrote Sampson, his friend, "Shall I toil away my best days in amassing a fortune? Are the lists worth entering when the only goal is gold? I know I shall never be rich, for I do not set sufficient value upon money, and it puzzles me much to account for the ardor and enthusiasm with which young and apparently noble spirits enter into the race for this bauble. Imbued with the romantic spirit of perfectionism, tempered by self-doubt that he would feel throughout his life, Samuel Howe was ready to become in Greece what he had no idea he would become: a hero, a chevalier, a philanthropist, and even the manliest man.